first thing I want you to know is you are important. And landowners often don't hear those words, but you're important to me, you're important to your communities, and you're certainly important to the future of this country. And after today, you're going to know why. What I'm going to do this morning is first talk about land use planning in general, so we're all sort of on the same level in part one, and then in part two I'm going to talk specifically about horse-friendly land use planning. Now, I live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is the home of the Pennsylvania Dutch. We have about 20,000 Amish in Lancaster County, and we have many more Mennonites as well. And as you can see here, we have many horses. We have thousands of horses in the county, and we also have thousands of road apples that they leave behind, which is an issue. But horses are very important to our community. What I'm going to start with today is actually a positive story from a place called La Habra Heights, which is in greater Los Angeles. And often what happens, and I'm sure you've experienced this, is that people move out from the cities or the inner suburbs out to the outer suburbs or the countryside, and they like the views that horse farms provide, but they don't necessarily like the smells, the flies, even some of the slow-moving cars and horse trailers on the road, that sort of thing. And often when you get enough of these newcomers, they gain political power and they go to their elected officials and they say, well, let's change some things here. And this seemed to have happened in La Habra Heights because the elected officials hired a consultant who I think obviously did not understand the horse business and horse people. And what the consultants suggested was, first of all, reducing the number of permitted large animals, horses, from 8 to the acre to just 2 to the acre, which could certainly affect people's lifestyle and livelihood. And second, they wanted to increase the setback of barns and riding rings from property lines from 25 feet to 50 feet. So the horse people weren't too happy about this, but they did some very smart things in this case. First, they got organized. Second, they read the general plan of La Habra Heights to say, what does our general plan say? What does our comprehensive plan say about the future growth and development of our community? Where should the development happen? What kind of community should we have? They also read the zoning ordinance, which is not necessarily the most exciting reading, but they really wanted to understand what the proposed changes were going to mean for them. And then they did something very smart as well. They went to the Planning Commission meeting to voice their opposition. Land use planning is a legal process, but it is also very much a political process. And you need to make your voice heard to the elected officials ultimately who make the legally binding decisions about land use, but also to the Planning Commission, which is appointed by the elected officials and makes recommendations about land use issues to the elected officials. And what the horse people were able to do is they pointed out, look, if you read our general plan, we have a goal in the general plan that says protect, preserve, and enhance the residential, rural character, and individual lifestyle. This proposed change to our zoning goes against this goal in the general plan. And the planning commissioner said, you people are right. And they turned down this proposed change. So I think there's some interesting lessons here. First of all, again, land use planning is a legal and political process. You have to make your voice heard. You have to attend the public meetings. And it really does help to be organized and speak as one large voice. Again, do your homework, read the documents, understand what they mean, understand what proposed changes or proposed developments mean for you. And finally, be polite but forceful. And above all, keep your cool. If you've ever been to planning commission meetings where people are screaming at each other, sometimes even throwing things, but if you keep your cool and you speak forcefully, chances are you're going to be taken very seriously and you're going to be effective in the long run. So just as an overview, with land use planning, don't wait until it's too late. And oftentimes people do wait until the crisis comes, and then, you know, sometimes you can stop it and sometimes you can't. Again, because it's a political process, the elected officials, county commissioners, city council, appoint a planning commission to advise them on land use issues. Okay? And the planning commission is responsible for drafting a comprehensive plan, drafting the zoning ordinance, drafting subdivision and land development regulations, but those all have to be approved by the elected officials to become, in effect, official documents of the community. Also, it's important to look at your state planning and zoning enabling legislation. It's a little bit different in every state. These were originally adopted way back in the 20s. They've been amended a number of times since then, so it's very important to look at your planning and zoning enabling legislation so you understand what can and can't be done through the land use planning process in your state. So the comprehensive plan, also known as the master plan or general plan, is the legal basis for zoning and subdivision regulations and other land use regulations. It's a blueprint of goals and objectives for how the county or municipality should grow, usually over the next 20 years. And it really sets out a vision for where development should happen, where development should not happen. And so it really is an important document, and it's important to get involved in the process of drafting or updating that comprehensive plan. Something that's very important for horse people is make agriculture and the horse industry part of that comprehensive plan. Demonstrate the value of the horse industry to the local economy and the community character and the way of life. This is not easy to do, and one of the reasons for this is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, when they come out with their agricultural census, county by county, they do not include the value of the horse industry in those agricultural numbers. And this can be very misleading. And I want to give you one example from Montgomery County, Maryland, which Susan knows well. If you look at how much the county farmers produced in 2007, which is the latest census, it's about $32 million a year, which for a county really isn't much agricultural output. But if you look at the value of the equine industry in Montgomery County, it's about $100 million a year. So you add those two together and you've got a $132 million industry. That's pretty important when you're talking economic development, when you're talking jobs, property taxes, you know, and overall economic activity, keeping land open, employing veterinarians, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important to their community, and certainly Montgomery County, Maryland has recognized that. The value of the horse industry is something you can put in the economic base section of the comprehensive plan. So it's really clear to someone who reads that document, yes, the horse industry is important. If you don't have a big horse industry, you know, at least the horse industry is contributing to the quality of life in the community, and that's something that also should be mentioned in the comprehensive plan because it does affect the community character, and that's very important. Another important element of the comprehensive plan is this land use section, and especially the future land use map. The future land use map lays out how the community, how the county should grow and develop over the next 20 years, and what kind of development should be located where. So that's something to keep a very close eye on. And also the future land use map is the foundation for the zoning map. So the zoning map and the future land use map are supposed to be consistent. So here's a future land use map. This is from Loudoun County, Virginia, which used to be known as the Virginia Hunt Country. I think it still is. But Loudoun County, if you're familiar with it at all, you're just outside of Washington, D.C., which is over here. And the eastern side of Loudoun County has been heavily developed east of Dulles Airport. And Loudoun County over the last 20 years has been one of the fastest growing counties in the United States. There's still a lot of hunt country over in this part of the county, some up here. And at the time this future land use map was put in place and adopted, the idea was to keep this very have a low level of development in these two places and really try to concentrate the development over here in the eastern part where most of the development is. And Loudoun County is an interesting place because they've gone back and forth in terms of their supervisors. Some have been really pro-growth and some have been really slow growth, and now the pro-growth people seem to be back in control there. And so it's really been quite a political struggle. Let me talk a little bit about zoning. The first purpose of zoning is to implement the comprehensive plan, to put the comprehensive plan into action. And zoning traditionally separates conflicting land uses. That's the original purpose of zoning as it was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court way back in 1928. So if you're talking about agriculture and you're talking about houses, they really are not all that compatible. And that's something that a lot of elected officials unfortunately don't understand. Zoning consists of two elements: a text, the actual written text, and the zoning map, again based on the future land use map. And the zoning text will describe the various zoning districts: R1 single family, R2 multifamily, A1 agriculture, C1 commercial, that sort of thing. And for each of those districts, you'll have a different density. For example, R1 might be 4 dwelling units to the acre, R2 might be 10 dwelling units to the acre, that sort of thing. It will also talk about limits to building height, setbacks of buildings from property lines, and how much of a property you can actually cover in buildings, known as lot coverage. The zoning ordinance will also spell out what are permitted uses. For example, in an agricultural zone, horse barns, riding rings would certainly be permitted uses, I would hope. Whereas, uses like gas stations probably wouldn't be permitted in an agricultural zone. Special exceptions are uses that you want to allow according to certain standards. Most common affecting the horse industry would be maybe the number of employees from off the property that you can have. It might be limited to 5, might be limited to 7, something like that. And then conditional uses might be something like, well, if somebody wanted to put in a racetrack, that might be a conditional use because that would affect the entire community rather than just the neighborhood. Finally, let me say something about zoning and private property rights and what a taking is. And this is certainly a very hot issue all across the United States. When you own property in the United States, what you really own is a bundle of rights to that property: water rights, mineral rights, air rights, and you also have the right to develop the property. That right to develop the property can be limited to some degree by zoning, but a zoning ordinance cannot remove all economic use of a property. If it does that, then that's clearly a taking under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and government would have to pay compensation to landowners if they did that. Some of you are from Florida. You're familiar with the Harris Act? Does that ring a bell? Well, the Harris Act is a similar act that the state of Florida passed in the 90s that said if a zoning ordinance or government regulation reduces the value of a landowner's property by more than, say, 10%, then the government has to pay that landowner compensation, which is a pretty strict law. So The way I look at the takings issue is, you know, zoning is a legitimate use of what's called the police power to promote the public health, safety, and welfare. But it has to be reasonable. For example, if you had a suburban area where most properties are 5 to 10 acres and people have horses on them, that's fine. And somebody came in and said, okay, we're going to create in this area an agricultural zone that allows only one house per 40 acres. That's just not reasonable. And it would be thrown out. It's not reasonable at all. So again, zoning is legitimate, but it has to be reasonable, and you do have a right to develop your land. This is a proposed zoning map, for example. This is a township in Lancaster County, literally about half a mile from where I live, and I've actually got an offer on a house in this township, so I may be living here very soon. And what's very good about it from an agricultural standpoint is the area up here in green is zoned for agriculture, and separating that agricultural area from the main development down here is basically an interstate highway, a limited access highway. So it's a nice split, and there's almost no sewer lines up here either. So there's not nearly the development pressure there is down below. So I think the township has done a pretty good job of planning so far. So here are some different kinds of agricultural zoning that you can use depending on where you are. Let's say we have a 100-acre farm here, and if you divided that 100 acres into 5-acre lots, you could put in 20 5-acre lots. Okay, and you see that often in sort of the outer suburbs, that pattern. Or you can have large lot, one house per 25 acres. So if you wanted to build a house, you'd have to buy 25 acres. And this large lot, or large minimum lot size zoning, is what you tend to find in places like the Midwest, and you find it in Oregon, and you find it in parts of California as well. This kind of zoning here, called area-based allocation, this is the kind of zoning we use in most of our townships in Lancaster County, where you're allowed one building lot per every 25 acres, but the building lot can be no more than 2 acres in size. So if you had 100 acres, you could carve off 4 building lots, a maximum of 8 acres, and you'd still retain 92 acres for the farm operation. And this is a balance that has worked pretty well for us. Another option you tend to see more in kind of outer suburban areas is this rural cluster, where you would put, say, 20 houses or so in this area and leave some area open here because you have a stream, and maybe up here this might connect to other properties, and perhaps you could put a trail here and have access to a trail network. So those are some different zoning options to consider. Let me talk a little bit about rezonings and variances, because this is how some of the changes happen in communities, such as the park that you talked about. First of all, a rezoning can come from the elected officials, can come from the Planning Commission, can come from landowners. They can all propose changes in the zoning, and you can propose to change the use. You can propose to change the density that you're allowed on a property. But when the Planning Commission hears a rezoning proposal, they are supposed to make a recommendation to the elected officials who make the final decision whether to approve this rezoning or not. And the Planning Commission is supposed to make what are called findings of fact. They're supposed to give written reasons for their recommendation. And I mentioned a Florida example here that I found where a woman, a horse owner, found that the Planning Commission had not made findings of fact, and she actually did go to the state of Florida and say, hey, something is wrong here. We needed to have reasons why this rezoning was recommended. And the state said, you know, you're absolutely right. So she really did her homework and really did, I think, a very good job of keeping the Planning Commission and the elected officials honest. If you don't make findings of fact, it's a violation of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which says elected officials cannot make arbitrary and capricious decisions. In other words, they can't say, well, we're just going to prove this, and not give any reason why they're approving something. Or they can't say, we're going to deny this, and not give any reason why they're denying it either. There's a famous case in Iowa where elected officials couldn't make up their minds, and so what they did is they flipped a coin to make their decision. That didn't go over well in court. I can assure you that wasn't the way to make decisions, flipping the coin. A variance is another way to make changes to the zoning ordinance. And first of all, the elected officials need to appoint what's called a zoning board of adjustment, or sometimes just called the zoning board. And the zoning board is kind of a curious animal that created way back in the 20s, because the zoning board makes a binding decision. They're not making a recommendation to the elected officials. They're making a legally binding decision. So if you want to challenge the decision of a zoning board, you have to take them to a court of appeals. Okay? So what happens is many developers prefer to go through the zoning board rather than go through a rezoning. Okay? So you really have to pay attention, because it's easier for them to get a change in the use, what's called a use variance, by going through the zoning board than to get approval for a change in use through a rezoning. I know it sounds like a subtle difference, but it's often really quite a bit bigger than that. The other kind of variance is called a physical variance, and that has to deal with the limitations of your property just because of the way you bought your property, or the way the property was when you bought it. And let me give you a quick example of that. One of my neighbors, when I lived in New York, wanted to extend his deck 3 feet into the setback. The setback was 15 feet, and he wanted to build 3 feet into the setback. So as a neighbor, I received a notice that my neighbor was wanting to do this. And you have to understand, my neighbor was the wholesaler for all the candy in Greater Albany, New York. And I can't oppose somebody like that. I just said, and plus 3 feet into, the setback wasn't going to reduce my property value or reduce my enjoyment of my property. And I said, sure, fine, that's not a problem. But if he had tried to change the use of his property from a house to a candy warehouse, I might have gotten a little more upset about that. Next are subdivision and land development regulations, and these speak to how a property gets developed. And I'm sure Denise worked on a lot of this as a landscape architect, because this is a lot of the work that landscape architects do. And it really describes what kind of infrastructure a developer is required to provide: sewer, water, and streets, sidewalks even. And I had an interesting conversation earlier this morning with David Shannon about this area here, and one of the things he said is, well, we're really trying to keep sewer out of this area. And what's happened since about 1980, about half the extensions of sewer lines have actually been paid for by developers, because they say, it's worth it to me to, to extend the sewer line half a mile, maybe even a mile, so I can get sewer to my development. And the way sewer lines work in terms of the cost is they're all based on average cost. So this means there's an incentive that once you extend a sewer line out into the countryside like that, there's an incentive to add all kinds of development in between, so you lower the average cost that everybody pays for the sewer fees. So keeping an eye on where your sewer lines are is extremely important. The layout of new development is also very important, especially, as I've found, for stormwater runoff. And a lot of developments get built next to farms, and the developers don't control stormwater very well. They're supposed to, in many cases, have retention basins and grass waterways and all those best management practices, but often they don't, and the developer leaves, and then the homeowners association takes over. And suddenly, the farmer next door wakes up and there's all this water running on his or her property. And I've found it's very difficult once that happens to get the homeowners association or the neighbor next door to clean up the problem. So the best thing is to make sure that there are stormwater management requirements for any development next to your property. Next, in the subdivision process, it's often negotiated much more than the zoning process between the elected officials or the planning commission and the developer. And if you write your subdivision ordinance correctly, you can require that there be new trails to connect to existing trails for horses, so that a new development just doesn't come in and and cut a trail and make it very difficult to continue riding. I have a good friend who works for the Urban Land Institute in Washington, D.C., and he has been quoted widely as saying, agriculture is the new golf. And now, because there's been a lot more interest in organic food, eating well, knowing who your farmer is, that sort of thing, we're seeing a number of developments combining agriculture with residential development. So on subdivision, you want a good layout, and this is an example from Lancaster County that is not the best designed subdivision that I've ever seen. You know it's suburban because it has these things. You got to have a cul-de-sac, right? So you show that it's a suburban development. And what I want to know is, how do these people figure whose lawn is getting mowed back here? I mean, it's a mystery to me. And this development probably could have used a third as less land and tied it much better into the village here as well. And what's this, by the way? That's called a stub street in the business, okay? This farm next door is permanently preserved under a permanent conservation easement. And it wasn't cheap, but we did it. And what do you think we did to the property values of all these people along the property line? We substantially increased their property value as well. And so hopefully it was a win-win situation, ultimately. Here's an example of, this is a proposed development in South Carolina of combining, it's 400 homes on 1,800 acres, but combining, horses with living out in the countryside. So again, another example of agriculture being the new golf. Many local officials still have the attitude that any kind of development is good development, because they're thinking that any kind of development is going to expand the tax base and is going to be beneficial. And over the last 15 years or so, 15 to 20 years, there have been a lot of studies called cost of community services studies that have shown that on average, the average new home demands more in services than it pays in property taxes. It's usually about $1.05 to $1.20 in services demanded for every dollar of property taxes generated. Whereas for agriculture, it's very different. It's usually 30 cents to 50 cents of services demanded for every dollar in property taxes paid in. And a lot of elected officials don't recognize that agriculture is a fiscal benefit for the community. And that's something that they need to hear, especially if they're trying to manage their budgets, which of course right now are very, very tight. On the other hand, I will recognize that commercial development, like agriculture, tends to pay in more in property taxes than it demands in services, and that's why commercial development is often widely sought after. Commercial development tends to pay in about $1 of property taxes for every roughly 30 cents or so that they demand in services. So that's a tough situation. So that's my presentation in general on land use planning, and then next we'll move on to horse-friendly. Eminent domain is really the ultimate power of government, and government can physically take your property through eminent domain if they are going to put that property to a public use. A public highway, a school, municipal building, but it has to be a public use. And in the process of eminent domain, they have to pay the landowner what's called just compensation under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. And sometimes that just compensation is determined by a judge as to what the actual dollar amount is. One of the things, I was going to talk about this a little later, but I'll get into it now, is one of the ways to minimize eminent domain actions that I've seen is a number of states have created what are called agricultural districts. Agricultural districts are not, land use restrictions. They generally provide landowners with certain benefits. They're voluntary, so you're not required to have your land in an agricultural district, so you have to enroll your land into it. In Pennsylvania, our agricultural district does three things. First of all, it does give our landowners some greater protection against eminent domain. We have at the state what's called the Agricultural Lands Condemnation Board. So if a local government says, okay, I want to condemn your farm for a highway or a school, then, and the landowner said, no, I don't want you to do this, then that government agency has to get approval from the state to do that condemnation if that land is in an agricultural security area. And that has kept some development and some government actions from happening. So it's really kept some eminent domain from happening. And I would say the majority of landowners who enroll in our ag districts in Pennsylvania are very much interested in that greater protection against eminent domain. The other two benefits of the ag district are local elected officials agree not to enact any nuisance ordinances that would restrict normal farming practices. So if you're pursuing what are generally recognized practices, raising horses, pasturing horses, and your neighbor starts complaining, your neighbor's not going to have a legal case. That's not to say your neighbor can't still take you to court and say, I want you to get rid of your horses, and you have to then defend yourself, which is an expense, but your neighbor's not going to win the case. And then the third benefit is the option to apply to sell development rights through the county-state purchase of conservation easements program.